Investment Committee meeting to order. The first order of business is roll call, please.
Henry Jones.
Here.
Richard Costigan.
Here.
Margaret Brown. Good morning. Good morning. John Chung, represented by Steve Juarez. Here. Rob Fechner. Good morning. Good morning. Richard Gillihan. Here. Dean Hollinger.
Here.
Priya Mather.
Good morning.
Good morning. David Miller.
Here.
Ramon Rubalcaba.
Here.
Bill Slayton.
Excused.
Teresa Taylor. Betty Yee.
Okay, thank you. The next item on the agenda is approval of the Investment Committee timed agenda. Are there any questions on the time agenda from committee members? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion.
Move approval.
Moved by Ms. Mather, second by Ms. Taylor. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, the item passes. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is executive report. Chief Investment Officer, Mr. Eliopoulos.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Investment Committee. Wonderful to be here for this August Investment Committee meeting, which traditionally is really our heaviest item in terms of time and number of agenda items and substance, really. So as I mentioned to you, Mr. Chair, earlier, I don't plan on making very expansive comments this morning. I just want to give the committee a little bit of context of what really kicks off in this August committee meeting through really the end of December. What kicks off today is the beginning of our program reviews for the committee. And for each review, and I'll just set the stage for you, each review you are presented a summary and information from your professional investment staff, and then that's combined with a review by your fiduciary third-party consultants for each of the programs that are being reviewed. So you get two views, two lenses reviewing the same information, so that the committee and its fiduciary obligation is able to really exercise your judgment by hearing from different fiduciaries of the system about the ongoing performance and risk within the programs. In August, you see total fund programs. So the first review for the committee today will be on the total fund, and you'll see your staff making a series of presentations by your senior investment staff, and then there's time for your independent consultants for the total fund and then for the constituent programs. So you'll hear reports from Wilshire and Makita and PCA. Then going forward into the fall, in September, we begin a series of in-depth looks at actually the constituent parts of the total fund. So in September, you'll see a report from your staff and again from your independent consultants of the constituent parts of the public asset classes. So you'll see a report on our global equity program in September in depth, and then a report on our global fixed income program in depth in September. We have a break in October, and then coming back in November, the investment committee meetings, you'll see a review of the private asset classes. So in November, you'll see your investment staff as well as the consultant give you a report on private equity and on the real assets program and its constituent parts. And then finally in December, wrapping up the year, we have an annual review of two important programs, our emerging manager and transition program, as well as a review of our responsible contractor program. So that's the setting. We've orchestrated the second half of the fiscal year to give this really in-depth review of the performance of the programs, and have staged it in a way to go from total fund to constituent parts. What's a bit new this August is we'll have a review not only of our trust level program. This is the second year that we've had that review as a program looking at the total fund. In addition to that, this year, for the first time, we'll have a program review of our opportunistic program, which is our newest program. And going forward, you'll see this review in August every year going forward if we keep the same schedule that we've had. So I wanted to level set for the entire committee, just to give you an idea of why we're bringing the total fund reviews today and a coming attraction of its constituent parts and asset classes coming to the future. So that's the setting for today. In addition, we have some other one-time agenda items that we think are important to bring to the committee's attention, one on Orion Sudan divestment, and another on the timing of the RFPs for your independent consultants that we just mentioned. So we really do have an extensive program today. Those are my remarks. I would suggest we move forward into the substance of the meeting. I did want to mention, I'm happy to take any questions and comments, of course. I did want to mention that I was going to do an introduction of some summer interns that are visiting us from CalPERS. They come every year. They're over on our trade floor right now. The review's going a little longer than anticipated. So at some point when they make their way into the auditorium, I'll just have them stand up. It's a wonderful program that CalPERS has, and we like to share information. And next month, I'll bring back some more information on our CalPERS internship program, as you recall, the 1,000 Strong program, and I'll give you information on how that program went this year and our plans for the coming year for that. So with that, Mr. Chair, that's my planned remarks.
Okay, thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is the approval of the June 18, 2018 Investment Committee meeting minutes.
Move approval.
Moved by Ms. Mothers, second by Ms. Taylor. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The item passes. Thank you. The next item is the information consent items. I've received no request to pull anything off of the consent, so a motion is in order for that item.
I'll move them.
Moved by Mr. Costigan, second by Mrs. Hollinger. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The item is received. Okay, agenda item, policy and delegation, the 6A, revision of private equity program policy, second reading.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I see Kit and Sarah coming up to the podium. And this is the second reading, and I'll turn it over to Kit.
Thank you. Good morning. Kit Crocker, CalPERS Investment Office staff. Item 6A is a second reading of staff's proposed updates to the private equity investment policy. As no further changes were requested at the first reading in June, attachments 1 and 2, which are clean and redlined versions of the proposed updated policy, are unchanged from the first reading. An updated opinion letter from the board's private equity consultant to Makita Investment Group is provided as attachment 3. As this is a second reading, staff is seeking action from the committee at this time. So with that, I'll pause to invite Makita to make any comments, and I'm also happy to entertain any questions from the committee at this time.
So Kit, I'll just clarify. So the red line changes that are before the committee are the red lines
Same
marked
as-
to versus the last, same as last month.
They're
same as the last time we
identical
did.
to last month, yes.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Okay, does Makita have any comments you'd like to make? You've seen none. Okay, this is an action item, so we need, Mrs. Brown.
Thank you. In looking over the policy and all the attachments, I'm just wondering, there's a table here that talks about co-investments. I'm sorry, I'm trying to find my little highlighted notes that talks about eliminating co-investments. Is that correct, that we're changing that? Because I thought when we talked about, we were trying to increase the number of co-investments.
Actually, what we've done is consolidate the two tables. So if you look on page, I'm looking at page 6 of 8 of the clean version.
Can you give me the number in the board on the diligent, the
Ted,
iPad? Do you know what
have
that is? Okay, so give me the table, the attachment.
So on the, well, let's see, on the red line, it is page 6 of 8. So basically, the page where you see it struck out, look at the prior page. And you should see it added to the table, the new table on staff authority limits.
Okay, and, all right, so we're not eliminating co-investments?
We're not eliminating, no. It's an additional column under staff authority limits.
Okay, that our staff can make. And then are we also changing the quartile rankings we can invest in? Before, it was like in the first quartile, and now the top quartile performance, and now they can go to another tier, is that correct?
So,
I should say tier, sorry.
Sarah Core, investment staff. So previously, there were different delegation limits if it was first quartile or second quartile, and now it's been consolidated, so first quartile and second quartile have the same delegation limits.
And so those have increased or decreased?
They've increased for second quartile and decreased for first quartile.
So that means staff has more flexibility or less, or both?
Both.
Okay, I'm glad I'm confused. It is a little confusing. And then can staff invest in third and fourth quartile funds? Are there limits to those?
They would need a prudent person opinion to invest in anything below median.
So that's a great point there. When you get a prudent person opinion, do you actually have to follow it? Because we may have had an instance in closed session where we didn't.
Staff does not have the authority to make a decision, or to make an investment if there is not a prudent person opinion if it's below median, so it would have to come to the committee.
So it would come back to this committee and where we would make a decision?
Correct.
Okay. And do we currently have a policy that where staff is recommending one and the prudent person opinion is recommending don't do it? Do we have a policy that says there's like a tiebreaker other than the board, like possibly using the board consultant to do that?
No, we don't.
Are we interested in doing that, anybody?
Well, I think it's a question of our fiduciary obligation. The board, as constituted by the investment committee, has that fiduciary obligation. They've delegated it to staff, and in the instance where there is a difference of opinion between a prudent person, an independent third party, and staff, the tiebreaker is the investment committee who holds that fiduciary obligation. The committee can, and with the advice of council, could consider a different policy, but that hasn't been recommended.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I might suggest that we take this up at some point in the future when we have an instance like what occurred in closed session.
Mrs. Brown, we should not refer to actions taken.
Okay, so I would like to
closed session.
suggest that, thank you. I would like to suggest that maybe we take that up again, looking at that policy when there is a difference of opinion, that we come up with a policy for our independent consultant or some format, so where the board isn't sort of blindly trying to decide to back one or the other.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Costigan.
Thank you, Mr. Jens. I just want to clarify, if there is in fact, while we have delegated to the investment office certain decisions, if in fact there is a difference of opinion between the investment staff and our independent counsel through the prudent person letter, the practice is to bring it to the board.
The policy is to bring it to the
Okay,
board.
so I just, Mr. Jones and Ms. Brown, I'm just trying to make sure. I believe we already have that policy in place. Okay, so the board acts as the tiebreaker. So it's not the third-party consultant. Is as long as everybody is aligned, there's no reason to bring it to the board. If in fact there's a disagreement among the two parties, then it is brought to the board for the board to make its decision.
That's correct.
Okay, so I think we may ask Ms. Brown either further clarification or the fact that I think we already have the policy
Yes.
that she's seeking.
Okay. That's true. Okay. Okay, Ms. Brown. Wait just a minute. You need to put your. Yes. Okay. There you go.
Thank you. And so my clarification would be I'd be seeking maybe not an amendment to the policy, but I'd like to see maybe a change in the practice where we do, in fact, ask our independent consultant for assistance. And I can't talk about what happened, and maybe we can talk about this in closed session, so I don't get myself into trouble. So bring it up there. Thank you.
Ms. Taylor?
And I will just agree with Mr. Costigan. I think we have a policy in place the board, it's our fiduciary duty to rectify the situation. I think the policy's fine. I'm not sure why we would bring our consultants in on that after, as long as we have been informed of what the situation is, I don't see why we can't make the decision. So I agree that I'm not sure that we need to review the policy.
Okay, Mr. Miller?
Yeah, again, I don't know exactly the policy, I'm sure, but I would wonder whether when we're following that policy, we can certainly ask staff questions, ask our consultants questions if they're here, but I think it would potentially be something to see whether the actual, the author or authors of the prudent person opinion would be available as a matter of policy to the board to ask them questions, because I haven't seen whether that's the case. So that's something I would be interested in knowing.
Yeah, and I'd just like to state that even though we have a policy, any board member could request a change to that policy at the appropriate time and at the appropriate place. So that before we move forward. No further questions on that. Thank you very much. And we do have this is an action.
Move approval.
Moved by Ms. Mather.
Second.
Second by Ms. Hollinger. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Seeing none, the item is approved. Thank you. Okay, we now go to the next information agenda item, CalPERS Trust Level Review. Mr. Eliopoulos, I think I saw your guests come in behind you.
Okay, great. Well, we're actually, yes. Terrific. So before we tee up item 7A, I already introduced in absentia the CalSTRS guests here, but we have the Scott Chan and Geraldine Jimenez, the deputy. Scott is the new deputy CIO of CalSTRS, and Geraldine, very familiar to CalPERS, as an investment director at CalSTRS, and they have with them 8 student interns, and they just finished a tour of our training program. They're standing up. We welcome you and thank you and wish you great luck on an incredible career in the investment world. Thank you for being here. We're actually not on this one yet. So, Mr. Chair, we are on item 7A, which is the board investment consultant request for proposal.
Okay.
Item.
Just to missed the item. I'm sorry.
So we'll have a different team up here momentarily. So 7A. This is what I mentioned in my opening remarks. It's a new item brought before the committee. And before I turn this item over to Elizabeth, I wanted to provide some background and perspective why we thought it was a good idea to bring this to the investment committee today for consideration. The opportunity brought before today is for the investment committee to consider the investment consultant RFP process, the manner about which, and really the timeline about which that you go about hiring your board investment consultant for either the total fund or for the various constituent parts of the total fund that you have separate consultants, namely private equity, real estate, infrastructure, and forest land. And before we really launched the status quo approval process for the RFPs, we would have normally brought an item to you in either September or November, just really kicking off the very next RFP that was scheduled to be brought. And this item shows you that there were 3 all at the same time. Before we just did that, we thought, and this process has been used for many years in a row, perhaps even a decade. Before we did that, we thought it would be a good idea, especially since we'll be having a new CIO here at the beginning, at the end of this year, beginning of next year, shortly. And I know there is a board governance review going on through the board governance committee as well, that it would be a particularly good time to just take a break, since these are your consultants, to give you the time to consider the timeline and process by which you wanted to kick off this next round of RFPs, to consider what total fund and private asset class RFPs that you wanted to run, to give you the flexibility to make any changes that you might want or not want. So that's the purpose of this relationship, as I underscored in my earlier remarks, between the investment committee and the board consultants, and as the discussion we just had on policy as well, underscores the importance of the relationship between this investment committee and the independent consultants that you hire, really to be your eyes and ears and checks and balances and another informed opinion as you exercise your fiduciary duties. So we thought it would be a good idea. We know we're adding to an already busy day. We could have just brought the items forward to replicate the status quo, but we thought it was a especially good time to take a break and consider whether or not we want to carve out some time for this committee to have a discussion about the roles of the investment committee consultants and how many you would like to have before we move forward with the regular timetable. So that's the background why this is before you this month, and I'll turn it over to Elizabeth to talk a little bit about what we have in the agenda item.
Sure. Thank you, Ted. Good morning, everyone. Elizabeth Borky, Chief Operating Investment Officer. So this item 7A is an action item. We are requesting the committee the approval to actually extend the term of Wilshire and Makita consultant contracts by 1 additional year for a total of 6 years, and at the same time reduce the term of PCA consultant contract by 9 months. The board resolution 9204B4 grants the board the authority to award a contract term of more than 5 years. This action aligns the expiration date for all the 3 board consultant contracts and delays the release of a competitive solicitation process, an RFP process, by an additional year. We have 2 reasons to make this request. One, as actually Ted just highlighted, one is policy related and one is also more administratively related. On the policy front, an additional year will provide the board and the staff the opportunity to analyze the consultant role, structure, and more closely align it with the total fund approach that we have identified in our INVO 2020 vision. From an administrative perspective, the realignment effort may reduce the number of competitive solicitation RFP needed to rebid the board consulting services from 4 to perhaps another number like 1 or 2. This reduction is in alignment with our strategic objective of reducing complexity. If approved today, staff will retain the fee schedule currently in place, addressing the reasonable cost provision of the delegation. Staff plans to bring a revised board consultant role structure to the committee for consideration and approval by early 2020. Happy to respond any question from committee members. I'll pause here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Juarez?
Yes, thank you, and good morning.
Good morning.
Wanted to clarify something, because it seemed as though extending 3 of the contracts and bringing back 1 of the contracts was based somewhat on a presumption about how many different RFPs we'd actually do. Am I right in making that assumption, or is there other factors that would govern us extending for the 1 additional year and then bringing back the other 1 year?
Yeah.
There's no presumption as to whether or not you end up with 1 or 4, but by aligning all 4 together, it would preserve your options to consider them all at one time and make that decision. The difficulty, if the time periods are staggered, there's less opportunity to consider these options.
Okay, I appreciate that. If we were to bring them back to 2020, though, and that would give us that opportunity, and yet, because as I reviewed the time needed, and again, I think it's somewhat dependent on what this board decides in terms of the number of RFPs, but if we were to say just to do 2, it seems to me that it would be reasonable to assume we could deliver the RFP and new contracts approved by the current date, which is June 30th, 2020. So I guess what I'm asking is, would it be possible to consider at least leaving ourselves the option of deciding by June 2020 to actually award the RFPs if, in fact, we're down to less than 4?
It's a good question. It really comes down to how much deliberation and forethought the committee wants to consider the role of the consultant and this question of how many consultants. If we need to schedule time for the committee to have that discussion, we then start to run into some timing constraints in terms of running multiple RFPs. If the committee gave us direction today to say, move forward with 2 RFPs, as your question underscores, without extensive consideration or reconsideration of the substance of the roles, then we could meet the timeline and bring this to a conclusion by the end of June 30th of 2020. But there's not a lot of slippage time in order to bring that. So this was really an extra year, was meant to give the committee and us time to have this extra round of deliberation over this. And if I were to score myself and score the staff, ideally perhaps we would have brought this a year ago in order to give you that flexibility. 1 year passed, but we're here today. The contracts expire June 30th of 2020, and we think it's makes sense to give collectively some time to make sure we're not up against a deadline and the committee's still deliberating over whether it should be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4.
But as it turns out, you're expecting us to have a decision sometime this fall. I assume, did I read November is the date by which we would know generally the direction provided to you relative to the number of RFPs we want to issue. Is that your thinking at this point?
It's by the beginning of next year, right?
Yes, by the beginning.
The beginning of next year is when we would expect that.
Oh, that decision. So I was thinking the fall. So we wouldn't necessarily tell you by, and again, I'm looking at my fellow board members as to how quickly we could make a determination. We've had at least a brief discussion about this so far. I don't know how complex the discussion will be, but I guess just extending contracts to me is, if it's absolutely necessary, certainly I'm going to go along with the flow, but I worry about putting off the decision one more additional year when we probably know what we want to do. I think we will by sooner than early next year. Yeah. So I just put that out to the board. I mean, if for the time being we can always revisit it, we want to extend it for one more year to 2021, that's fine, but I would just hold open the possibility that we may want to come back to the staff and saying, let's try to wrap this up by June 30th, 2020. Okay. That's
it's a valid point. And, we would have to agendize the discussion, and then how long does it take to promulgate the whole process for an RFP once that's done?
It really depends on how many RFPs that we have to process, because we have to sequence them. As you know, there's quite a choreography around the RFP process, including investment committee member participation in parts of the process. So if we're going to run 4, we need to stagger them. If there are fewer, then it can go much faster. So we didn't want to presume to get ahead of the committee in terms of how many consultants you might want to have, whether you've have a firm opinion or not. Really, just to give the timeline for the committee's benefit, if you want the section in the staff report that mentions this fall for Mr. Juarez, that's if we go with the status quo. Then we'd be back this fall, this November, with the beginning for the 3 consultant RFPs. And that gives you an idea of we need to start that RFP process then in order to be complete by June 30th of 2020. If the committee liked the status quo and wanted to move forward, that's what we would do. We'd be back here in November and we'd start that process.
So if the committee were to decide that we calendar this for a discussion of this item early next year, and then whether to extend or not would be based on the outcome of that discussion.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And to Mr. Juarez's point, then I think that may be the appropriate way to deal with this, is to let's have that discussion to see what we want to do, and then that will dictate how long, whether or not to extend or stay the course. Okay? Okay, that's one option. Ms. G?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a practical question about the PCA contract. Do we have the ability to terminate it 9 months?
Yes, the committee, yes, we do.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I actually would like to request that we agendize a discussion about the scope of services going forward. I think one of the things that may not be apparent to the public is that the value that the consultants bring to us, and I happen to like having multiple consultants because I think multiple perspectives just helps better inform us, but that there's a lot of value in terms of the individual interaction that I, as a board member or a member of this committee, have with the consultants as well, and sometimes that's not apparent in terms of some of the work that we do individually with the consultants or how we utilize their services for expertise. I would like to see a discussion from the perspective of it's always been kind of a rub about who's actually directing the work and the expectations of the consultants. And I think the consultants at times feel like they're kind of stuck in the middle. They work very closely with the staff, and yet in terms of their relationship with us, maybe a little less clear. And so I would really welcome a conversation about that, and maybe that's all embedded in what we can articulate relative to the scope of services going forward and the structure of the RFP.
Okay. Yeah, and unless the committee has a different viewpoint, I will direct staff to agendize this next year so that we could have that discussion to help us
Thank you.
form our opinion of where we want to go with this. Okay, Ms. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to say that I agree with Ms. Yee's comments. I do value the individual consultants that we work for, and I really wouldn't want to give up the benefits of the individual asset class expertise. What's not in here is what this consulting help does to increase our returns, and what would happen if we instead don't have that individual asset class expertise. What does happen with our returns? And I know you can't predict that, but it's a big concern if we lose that expertise. So I'd be happy to have that conversation in the very near future about how we move forward. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Rubalcaba?
Thank you, Mr. Jones. I just had a clarifying question. I think you sort of clarified a bit. In the memo, it talks about if we stay with the status quo, you would have to return in November to the committee, but to initiate 4 separate RFPs. But then right now you said 3, and that was my question because there's a 2-year difference between 2 branches of them. So I just want to clarify that.
Right. There are 3 that expire in June of 2020,
Right.
and then PCA is the 4th. Is 2 years later, as you say. So really, it's the pressing time matter are the first 3, where the expiration is on June 30th, 2020. So the challenge with the chair's direction, just to underscore expectations, is if we agendize the full discussion regarding the board's role, which we're recommending would be healthy to have that discussion. and the committee ultimately decides that it would like to move forward with these 3 RFPs and then subsequently a 4th 2 years later, that there will be some timing issues to get all 3 completed by June 30th of 2020, and an extension may be needed. But we could take that up in the new year, but I just want to set expectations that that we might need an extension if that discussion on role precludes us from processing 3 separate RFPs and meeting that June 30th, 2020 deadline.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you clarified that because depending on what we decide will dictate the timeline.
Yes. Right.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Costigan.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. And I'd like to say to the investment office, appreciate you all bringing this forward. I know RFPs are complicated. I think the direction, at least I've heard, is for us to put the item over, have a discussion about consultants' roles of discussion, clarifying, because one of the things I wanted to make sure, and I just don't see it in the materials, we still retain the 30 days to terminate any contract. That's correct? Okay.
That's correct.
Because I just want to, and then the other issue to just think about working with Ms. Malm, and I think Mr. Gillihan may raise this issue, is to me an 18-month RFP seems like an extremely long time, and we have to figure out what the problem is. When I respond to RFPs, it's typically 45 days, and I see lots of RFPs from local governments, so I'm not sure why an RFP for us is so complex that it's August of 2018, and we're talking about something 3 years from now. So again, I'm looking to you, Elizabeth, as you're going to be running this process, is what is wrong with the process that requires 18 months to do an RFP? And I don't need an answer now, but at some point when we come back to this item, particularly when we only have 4, what the concern is. And if that's staffing or process, we need to address that as a core issue. Thank you, Mr. Jones.
Okay. Mr. Gillihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'd like to say I completely agree with where Mr. Juarez was headed, and should he make a motion along those lines, I'd be happy to support it. In my experience, and I've dealt with a lot of RFPs in my career, is these things tend to expand to consume all the available oxygen. And so if we set deadlines that are so far out, it's going to take that long. But I believe with direction from this board that we could have a decision in time for the 3 that are going to expire in almost 2 years from now, without the need to decide to extend them today. And again, this board can always make a decision later to extend those contracts or to terminate other ones early if we have a strategy that changes going forward. So.
Yeah, and I think that's consistent with what I've heard from all members. Okay. Mr. Miller.
Yeah, I guess kind of in the same camp as Richard. I'm wondering if rather than agendizing that more extensive conversation for next year, if we could get it on our calendar in late fall, winter, to give us that extra time, but also to not unnecessarily delay having that conversation and making those decisions.
We've looked at the calendar, and the calendar is really packed through December, but we'll look again to see if there's a spot that we can interject it. As the committee was discussing it, I was thinking one probably really good opportunity for that role discussion would be the January offsite. Would be a good time for that, perhaps. But we'll also look at the November and December agenda, and if we can carve an item, we'll look to further this from a timing standpoint. But there are some constraints.
And I think just to add on that, we wanted to give you extra timing, not only from an administrative perspective, but really for you to have the possibility to have a discussion after the review, the governance board review, right? Where you can really think what are the different roles and importance of each of the different consultants and have a sort of a complete discussion about it, given the governance kind of survey that you're doing.
Okay, thank you. So we will not take an action on this item, and we will ask that you add a follow-up item to see when the earliest this can be returned for that discussion, but no later than, say, off-site in January. Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, now we will move to the 8th item, 8A, CalPERS Trust Level Review.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The format for this is very familiar to the committee. You have some familiar faces joining us now. This is the review of this past fiscal year, and what we start off with is a summary and review by CalPERS Chief Economist John Rothfield on the macroeconomic environment that prevailed and what we see going forward. So we'll start with that and questions and answers for Mr. Rothfield, and then following that, I'll turn it back over to me, Elizabeth, and Eric to go through the presentation on performance, attribution, and risk, as well as a newer face, although you saw Rob Patterson last year. We'll bat cleanup. We'll be the last presenter to talk about our GIPS compliance this year for our return performance. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Rothfield.
Thank you, Ted. And again, it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you about the macro backdrop that informs asset class performance and hear your questions and concerns. I appreciate the opportunity. So compared to when we were here earlier in the year in February, the US economy has outperformed probably expectations over that period of time. And for the whole fiscal year, the US economy grew by 2.8% compared to the average of the first 8 years of the economic expansion of 2.2%. So there's been a 6/10 increase in growth in the latest year, which is unusual this far into a business cycle, but it's fairly easy to achieve higher growth when you have a $1.5 trillion fiscal expansion, which the government put in place, so $1 trillion corporate tax cut and a $500 billion for the household sector. So most sell-side analysts had believed that the addition to the economy this year and next from the fiscal loosening that happened in the US is about 6/10 growth in 1 year, and that's exactly what we've had. So really the debate is about the future, whether this is an economy that's going through a supply side improvement, or whether we're just creating demand that's going to ultimately close down the expansion fairly quickly. So a lot of the discussion around at the moment is about the longevity of the US business cycle. So we've now been growing in the US for 9 years. The US record since they started dating business cycles has been 10 years. So the question is whether we can go on like some other countries and have a longer expansion than 10 years, because I would say the median estimate in the market right now is the economic expansion here in the US goes about another 3 years. We have had examples like the UK and Canada where from 1992 to 2008 there were 17-year economic expansions. That was roughly the same as the Japanese expansion from the mid-70s to the early 90s. And my own home country, Australia, has not had a recession since 1992. So, people are starting to think about whether we can actually go past the 10-year, which has typically provided a stop for US economic expansion, which is important for the performance of risk assets versus safe assets going forward for the next few years. So, going specifically to page 2, and I don't, this guy is not working. Okay. Facing it that way. Yeah, thank you. So we typically do, I know the board in the past has liked this table on what's trending, and you can see in the economy that more has been trending positive than negative over the last 6 to 12 months. As I mentioned, economic growth has improved by 0.6% in the latest year. In the latest data for gross product, we had a lot of historical revisions which seemed to show that the savings rate by the household sector in the economy was much higher than we thought. And that's very important because it means that if the household sector is saving, it's providing a flow of revenue into mutual funds, bonds, stocks, and pension funds more than we had, in a way that we had previously thought was starting to dissipate as people started to feel confident and were spending more. We're now starting to revise back to a situation where we are actually getting a lot of household savings. So that was actually a positive that was announced only a couple of weeks ago and encouraged people to think that the expansion could last for longer. Another interesting trend in the US economy has been small business plans to expand and hire. Small businesses are very significant employers in the economy, and their problem is finding qualified workers to actually pay to fund their expansion plans. They're having to start to increase wages to do that, and in some cases may not find the worker and have to ditch those plans. Corporate earnings and sales has been strong. Again, that's not that difficult when you've got a $1.5 trillion fiscal loosening that happened in the economy. Mining and manufacturing have also been going particularly well. Mining a function of the improvement in global energy prices. You've seen mining states like Texas, North Dakota, etc., improve in relative terms in terms of their hiring and their gross state product. Housing trends have also been very encouraging. We've had a pickup in household formation, annual household formation, and more of that has happened in owner-occupied as opposed to rental. So owner-occupied fell sharply after the recession. Owner-occupied has now started to improve, and even more encouragingly, more ownership-based household formation is coming from young people and from folks who are in the lower half of the total income cohort. So that's another encouraging sign in the economy. The Fed also believes that US financial system stability remains quite strong. Surveys of loan officers is showing that there hasn't been a significant drop-off in demand for loans or tightening standards. Whether right or wrong, that means that we're not late cycle in that perspective as well. And the global business cycle has actually had a good couple of years. Now, if you go across to the negative side, it gets to this issue about whether labour force participation and productivity, which are the two ways you can extend a business cycle when you've got a very low unemployment rate. We've yet to see the data that shows that we're going to get that cycle prolongation by an improvement in those two factors of the economy. Other couple of problems that could arise in the future is that because we've had pretty good economic performance, some of the central banks around the world are starting to withdraw liquidity. The Fed started to do that as recently as last October. The European Central Bank has decided it won't be buying any more debt after January 1 next year. And even the Bank of Japan has loosened up a little bit tightened up a little bit its loose monetary policy as well. So some folks believe that some of the asset price reflation we've had is due to all this liquidity that's been added by the main three central banks, and that's becoming less of a supportive of financial assets as the global economy improves and that source of liquidity goes away. Another couple of factors which are clearly evident are emergent trade wars. I think it's underappreciated how much the improvement in global trade in the last couple of years has contributed to the performance of the US economy, not only foreign economies. And if we have a trade war that takes down growth of global trade, that could be problematic for risk assets. And then, of course, the disruptive geopolitics. So we've cleared a lot of those hurdles, but in the fourth quarter of this year, we have some issues around both whether the UK is going to indulge in a hard or soft Brexit, and, for example, in Italy, whether the government, the new five-star movement and League government is going to try and engage in policies which increase their borrowing and puts them at odds with what's happening in the rest of the euro area. The other problem, of course, in the geopolitical space is emerging markets, where emerging markets have actually had a poor year despite good economic performance. Everyone from Turkey to Brazil to China starting to slow down a bit, and they haven't been able to get out of the early business cycle phase. So again, I would say most of the factors that we're seeing, both past and even leading into the future, are positive, but we have some negatives that we do have to worry about, as usual, in terms of whether we worry about risk assets at all. So I just wanted to address a couple of those constraints on the US expansion, how long it can go, pages 4, 5, and 6 of the material, going through very quickly, we have something called the non-employment rate in the economy, which is not only people who are looking for work, but people who haven't looked for work for 12 months, and a reasonable reckoning of people who are still out there and don't even know that they could potentially look for work in the future. That so-called non-employment index in the economy has gotten very low. So the question is, maybe if we continue to get strong growth, you can pull more people than we think out of non-employment into the labour force and into jobs, but it may be difficult and they may be very low productivity experiences in the economy. On page 5 is this issue of labour force participation, which is that, that's the one, yep. Page 5 is that the labour force participation rate is being held down in the economy because we have an ageing population. So as people tend to get over 55, their participation in the labour force halves from 80% to 40%. So just compositionally, you're getting low participation in the labour force. And then the other problem is that even within some cohorts, particularly in prime age, you're getting low participation continuing. The clearest example of that is in the age 25 to 34, where female participation in the labour force has picked up to where it was before the recession. Male participation of 25 to 34-year-olds remains very low across whites, other cohorts in kind of racial cohorts in the labour force. So that's a big question about whether that group can ever improve its labour force participation. Quite frankly, as of yet, we haven't really seen that improvement. It's still going sideways, despite the improvement in the economy and efforts to address various things. And one element of that is there is this concept of maybe a semi-generation that was educated during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. They got their degrees, but their skills got degraded because it took a long time to find jobs. And therefore, that generation may never retain or regain the labour force participation that they had before. So that's still a very open debate in the economy about whether we can get that going. Then on page 6, you can circumvent a low labour force growth by looking at so-called productivity, which is what output benefit you get from adding incremental labour to the labour force. Now that, in this expansion, has only grown at 1.1%. There's some talk that low productivity rate is biased downward because the government does a poor job of measuring technology, such as what we're getting from cell phones, etc., on economic growth, but it is clearly lower and hasn't improved yet. Now there's a leading indicator of productivity, which is on the right-hand side, and unfortunately that line that looks up now should look down because it's been revised, and it's essentially saying that companies have done a very good job of increasing actual and prospective employment, but the output side isn't increasing commensurately, so that's actually low productivity. One of the examples there is manufacturing. We've had a significant improvement in manufacturing employment in the last year or so, but manufacturing output or investment in manufacturing equipment and plant has actually been coming down. So that's low productivity. So the jury is still out on this median estimate that the expansion has about 3 years to run. If it did have 3 years to run, that would probably be good for risk assets. The Fed would be moving gradually to a higher rate. The Fed thinks it's halfway through what it's going to do, and that would probably be fairly constructive for markets. But at this point of a business cycle, you never know what's going to turn it over, particularly when you've got these global issues. Just wanted to go to 2 more charts, one on pages 9, which is that we and others don't only look at the US business cycle, we look at the business cycles of other jurisdictions, so China, Japan, and Europe as well. You can see there that a lot of the US indicators that we look at are still in mid-cycle as opposed to late cycle, so there's some debate about whether we're late mid or early late cycle in the US economy. In China, when we look at that economy has softened. It hasn't been in a recession since the 80s, but it has softened. And now they're going through an easing process. They're cutting interest rates, they're easing up on credit constraints, and they are loosening their budget policy to allow more spending. Whether they're successful in being able to engage in another rebound in the Chinese economy depends on whether they can stop capital outflow from China. Europe is also in mid-cycle, which is constructive for assets as well. Japan is probably late cycle. They've managed to improve their economic performance by increasing dramatically the hiring of women, elderly people, and temporary immigrant workers, but they're reaching the end of the line on their ability to be able to do that and continue to get above potential growth. So page 11 goes to the issue of leverage and valuation. Leverage in this expansion has been going sideways. And again, it gets to this issue about the fact that the household sector has been very responsible. It's not like the 2000s where we all took out leverage, took equity out of our homes, etc., and engaged in a spending spree. That hasn't happened in this cycle. We're actually putting savings into the system at the moment, which is good, and the government deficit has been getting smaller to kind of match the increase in corporate leverage. And then valuations are high, but in every country valuations have gone up. And then finally, on a conclusion on page 14, what I wanted to get across from macro was that on balance, if you look at central and upside, you're getting about 2/3 of the outcomes over the next 6 to 12 months when you look forward with this. And then there is always this elephant in the room, which is some of the downside risk. Trade wars, nationalist policies, which are negative-sum game. The Fed or central banks tighten too quickly, and that takes away the punch bowl from the economic expansion we're having. So that's the end of my presentation.
Okay, thank you. We have a few questions, but I want to thank you for the presentation. I always look forward to your insights from an economic point of view.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, very much. Okay. Mrs. Mather.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rothfield. As always, an instructive summary or assessment of the economy. I do have a few questions. The first is that on Friday, as you know, the Labor Department reported that inflation has outstripped wage growth and that wages are actually, in real terms, going down slightly, but on the way down. Have you considered what the implications of that might be if that becomes a long-term trend?
Yes, there's something called real personal disposable income, which is income after taxes and after being dissipated by inflation, and that number is not really turned negative yet, but we do have 3% consumer price inflation and wage growth of nominally wage growth of 2.7%. Although I will say part of that lower wage number is due to compositional effects. So if you take one worker compared to a year ago, their wages are rising by 3.2%, a little bit more than inflation. When you look at inflation right now of 3%, many people think this is the top of the cycle. The main reason we've had higher inflation in the latest year has been higher energy prices compared to a year ago, which is feeding through into gasoline prices. And the impact of that is starting to turn down. So if you look at Wall Street and our own estimates for inflation, by the end of the year, you could well be down to about 2.25% inflation by the end of the year. So a lot of this is due to gasoline and oil drive about 75 to 80% of headline inflation. And we're seeing kind of a peak now in that impact. So I would say, as a forecaster and what we're seeing from the street, is we probably get a fairly strong growth continuing in personal disposable income after the tax cuts, and we're going to start to see a bit of a dissipation in inflation from the gasoline sector going forward.
Okay, thank you. One other thing that you talked a bit about is tightness in the labor market. And to what degree is immigration policy currently impacting that? Because you mentioned that with respect to Japan, that they're using immigration as a way to source workers.
Yep.
And that's obviously been something that in the U.S. has been quite a prevalent dynamic as well. But so could you talk about what the perspective?
Yeah, so that comes down to the issue of how the relevant population of 16 to 16-plus age group, because now anyone's working. It doesn't matter how old you are. So let's say 16-plus population, and then the growth of the labour force, which is people in that cohort which either have or are looking for a job. We haven't seen anything yet in the population growth numbers that reflects intentions to slow down immigration into the economy. Maybe that will happen in the future as some of the immigration policies take hold of the administration. Then you might start to see a slowdown in population growth, which makes it even more difficult to get the labour force that you need to fund a long expansion. And I know there's a lot of proposals out there. The business sector is advocating for a skills-based, but also a broader immigration policy that allows the expansion to continue. One of the areas that we're seeing it is in construction. House prices have kept rising in part because there's a demand for household formation, but housing construction in the last 6 to 12 months has actually declined because you haven't been able to, in part because you haven't been able to find the workers given the competing objectives and then the slowdown in the growth of maybe that immigrant workforce.
And then finally, my last question is, you talked about the improvement in manufacturing employment, but that productivity overall is down. And is that, do you think, just a lag that as they're training new workers, that it takes a while for the productivity to manifest, or is there something else at work?
I would say, and then also manufacturing had a lot of unused capacity anyway, so you have to increase your rate of capacity utilization before you start making new investments in plant and equipment. That's one thing happening. And then probably if you're starting to increase your production lines, you'd take any worker that's available, and then maybe there's some training that could occur over 2 to 3 years that would allow that to improve. But again, I think this Wednesday we get the productivity numbers for the second quarter. There's one side expecting, hey, this is going to be a great number, and another side saying, not so fast, we're just adding workers but not growth in output yet. So it's become almost an ideological rather than an analytical issue about what's going to happen.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, Ms. Yee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to go back to the trending slide on page 2. There was one element that actually really intrigued me, and that had to do with the shift from renting to home owning, which seems not to be the case here in California. So curious where that's happening.
Yeah, in the attachment in the attachment material on page on page 24, I have some of that information on household formation trends. So definitely there's no such thing as a national housing market. It's all regional. Right. And what you definitely find, there's one measure of housing affordability which breaks down into a couple of hundred cities in the US, and you can see that clearly in the Bay Area and also Southern California you've reached extremes in terms of affordability, et cetera, whereas nationally we're in about the middle range of affordability. And therefore, you can definitely see at a national level from that slide on page 24, that top right, that the number of owner households has been increasing, and the number of rental households, which made up all of the growth for the major part of the expansion, has started to come down a bit. And then again on the bottom left, you can see that below median income has had an increase in participation in ownership. And then by age cohort, it's been under 35. So, whether this is good data or not, clearly at a national level there has been some improvement, and maybe 9 or plus years into an economic cycle, the rich tend to do well earlier. And then ultimately you get, I don't want to call it trickle down, but I think that ultimately at some point in the cycle, even those who have been left behind start to get a relative improvement. It's still a very small relative improvement, but it's encouraging nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Just kind of from your perspective and those of economists generally, so as the Fed begins to wind down its quantitative easing program, what are the signs that you're going to be looking for that signal a potential market downturn? And is the Japanese economy instructive in that way?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because the Fed, both the Fed and the European Central Bank, have very well intentioned what they intend to do in terms of balance sheet runoff, particularly the Fed. The only question about the Fed is when they stop doing it. They're probably going to have to end up with a much bigger balance sheet than they had before this recession because of changes in some relationships within the banking sector. So there is a question about when they actually stop drawing down the balance sheet, but they've telegraphed it for a long time. So interestingly, forward-looking asset markets should already be adjusting to that new reality of lower balance sheet. But ultimately, you know, it's almost like the boiling frog. At some point, everyone knows that this drawdown is going on, but then you start to actually see less demand for bonds and stocks coming from that liquidity drawdown. And then there's a tipping point in markets. And that was very much the case in the 2000s. 2007, the Fed was still tightening. I think May of 2007 was its last rate hike. Still had things were going fine. The recession actually started only 7 months after that. Mm-hmm. So that gets to this issue about, yes, maybe we are going to be getting a longer expansion, but you never really know what that tipping point is going to be, and maybe it's just an accumulation of factors exacerbated by the withdrawal of liquidity. One of the more encouraging things is that balance sheet drawdown is conditional. The Fed can always go back to tightening at some point or even cutting interest rates. So there's a conditionality about the drawdown that encourages some people to think that we can go on for longer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. A couple of other questions. You mentioned Brexit, still waiting to see whether it will be a hard or soft Brexit. With respect to the federal tax cuts, are there economic forecasts in the making with respect to what we can expect the impact to be on the federal tax cuts?
The household tax cuts to the household sector or the corporate sector?
Both, household and corporate, yeah.
Yes, the median opinion is that it would add about 0.6% to growth both this year and next year, and then we would have a bit of a cliff in 2020 as the stimulus impact of the tax cuts dropped off. And as I mentioned, you know, in the latest year we had 2.8% growth, mm-hmm. and that's kind of 0.6 higher than the pre-average for the expansion. So we're kind of getting that 0.6 run rate on growth improvement at the moment. And one of the things that's helped that strategy has been that normally you would get so-called crowding out, so that when government came in, bond yields would go up and that would crowd out the private sector. But in this case, bond yields haven't gone up in a noticeable way, partly because, again, this global QE that's going on. And also, you know, pension funds, particularly corporate pension funds and others, have been buying bonds, partly due to some tax issues. And so you haven't had the so-called crowding out that typically happens. So they've been able to get a free lunch in the early stage of this fiscal expansion.
Good, good. And then last question, then obviously trade and tariffs and all that have impacts. And the response from China has, relatively speaking, been pretty measured. If the Chinese government should become more aggressive, any thoughts about what we ought to be worried about with respect to the fund?
Probably more worried about at China level because they are going through economic slowdown. So the question is whether they have the levers, for example, with fiscal policy to reopen their infrastructure projects again. One interesting thing about China that came out of last week's data is China doesn't have a external surplus anymore. It's got a surplus with the US, but basically its current account is back to zero, which is unusual. So you may actually just see a reconfiguration of trade imbalances between one area and another rather than a significant net hit to China. And again, what they're doing right now is they're cutting their interest rates and they are boosting their fiscal, and they have the wherewithal to do that because they're a very high savings country. So I tend to have a more sanguine view about how this could end. I don't think it's going to have much effect on the US. And the question is, can China re-engineer its expansion and recalibrate it in the case of a trade war? And history says it can do it, but there was an incident in 1415 that caused China to turn over and them to suffer capital outflow, which reduced their degrees of freedom. And that's one thing that we have to worry about.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Mr. Rothschild.
Mr. Juarez?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. It was incredibly understandable, which I appreciate coming from an economist.
Sorry about that.
A couple of your charts had these gray bars, and at first, until I got to page 11, I didn't realize, or I sort of assumed they were recession periods on the gray bars.
That's correct, yes.
And if you go back to page 4, I think it's just worth noting that what appear to be during times of full employment, at least as we would normally categorize it, it was almost the onset of the next recession, almost to a T every time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of where we're at today, and it's no magic, it doesn't take a wizard to say people are predicting some sort of downturn, but clearly it's at a time when you see these numbers of employment that we start to feel the recession. And I guess my question would be for you to just tell us, pontificate on why that is. Why is it that we can't have a prolonged period of low unemployment and steer clear of these bars?
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, a lot of those last recessions have been due to financial cycles, not economic cycles. So the Fed's got a dual mandate of inflation and employment, implied dual. So they look at both, really looking at 2% inflation. But so that's the mandate. But often the recession tips over when you've got a financial excess, whether the savings and loans in the late 80s or early 90s. The tech bubble in 2000, and then the subprime and other leverage crisis that you had in the 2000s. So it really wasn't due to the low unemployment rate. So it is possible, and so it was really the financial cycle turned over the economy, which started to get firms to fire people, and then the unemployment rate turned around. So it wasn't the low unemployment rate per se that ended. And you can have, like I mentioned, the country Australia, you can have a period where the unemployment rate goes around in a kind of a sine wave. It doesn't sideways trend at a fairly low level without triggering a recession. The other thing in the economy right now is that the wage share of GDP is incredibly low historically and the profit share very high. So you can have a point where scarce labour causes a rise in wages, but it doesn't collapse the economy because you have plenty to go in the wage side before you start to hit profits. And then, of course, more wages you're paying, your top line's improving anyway. So it is possible. There's a lot of debate at the Fed around what's so-called NAIRU, which is the accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. It could actually be lower than we think. And then this issue about whether you can get labour force growth that stops the unemployment rate falling. But yes, I think you're right, is that it's not the low unemployment rate per se that's causing the recession, it's other factors at the moment.
So purely coincidental in those three cycles.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it coincidental. I would say that as the economic expansion continues, you're getting very strong hiring. So always at the end of a cycle, you have a very low unemployment rate. It's very rare that a recession starts from a high unemployment rate. Whether one causes the other is more questionable.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Costigan?
Hey, Mr. Jones, I always find your report fascinating. So I look forward to it. I think the data is just amazing. So I want to quote Joe Deere a little bit. Joe always used to talk about the market's animal spirits. And the one thing that I don't see tracking in these charts is sort of the fear that's in the market right now. A few months ago, I had a good discussion with David Crane. It's sort of just to understand, everything seemed inverse. Bonds were up, markets up, right? Everything's working in reverse economics. And we all wait on what's going to be said each morning. You open up your Twitter feed and what is it today? Last week it was Turkey. And so you look at the data, and I just note, so we have rising interest rates, which are, folks got used to cheap money. The problem is I'm looking for a new car, and if it's not at 0%, I'm not buying it. Which I know is going to begin having an impact long-term on the auto market because you got used to cheap money. And we're seeing rising housing prices, I think, as Controller Yee talked about, particularly in the Bay Area. And then we have wage stagnation. And you're right, while it quite hasn't tipped, we've seen a little bit growth. Every 0.25% increase in interest rates begin squeezing people out in a housing market that stays flat. But when you have a housing market moving at 7 or 8% and rates moving at 0.25% and wages not moving sort of back to Mr. Juarez's points, when you start looking at the charts, you see all this information, and it's hard to look at that the fundamentals are strong. And then you get Governor Brown, and I want to give him a lot of credit, on August 6th said, 2 years from now, we're going to be in a recession. We have to start planning as though we're going to be into one. And so we have these great numbers to Ted and his staff for June, so things look good. But then you start looking at core inflation. We're right back to where we were in 2008. You look at housing, I mean, it is just skyrocketing. And I think, as you said, the Feds, it's 2 or 3 more. And as Controller Yee said, quantitative easing is coming to an end, although you can play with a little bit with the books. But what I'm concerned about, or at least would like your opinion, is as we roll into the midterms, right, there's Dem's going to win, Reap's going to win. Not asking you which side's going to win, but I almost fear from the standpoint that as we move towards November, people are going to begin making economic moves. That back to the animal spirits, it becomes a herd mentality. Is I start selling, and then it goes, and it goes, and it goes. And with all of this, do you see, I mean, because one thing I'm thinking about long term is when you look at the discount rate and the returns on the system, right? So you talk about the core fundamentals, but we're talking about something 2, 3, 4 years from now for our members that'll be here 50, 60, or 70 years. It would almost seem at this point to take a conservative stance in the world because we're sort of at the trailing end of all the data. I mean, I know that's a long question, but I just kind of want your thoughts on that.
I definitely take your point there. There are some numbers that shows that the consumer sentiment is very high, but it is fairly fragile. So if the stock market falls, the question in the Conference Board survey, do you expect the stock market to be higher or lower in the next 12 months, falls along with the stock market. So people take a very short-term view based on recent performance. So you could easily get from a virtuous to a vicious cycle in terms of consumer sentiment as it pertains to the stock market, and they get people acting in a way that is self-fulfilling. The other area that's fairly volatile is consumer plans to buy a home. So consumer plans to buy a home have been very elevated. They've come off fairly sharply recently as well. Maybe as affordability has dropped off a little bit as interest rates go up. So there is some fragility in the sentiment that helps to drive and a self-reinforcing virtuous cycle in the economy. So it does really come down to this question about we are 9 years into a cycle. The median estimate is we have another 3 years to go. If that's true, then risk assets should perform fairly well. But then there's the conundrum of in that late part of a cycle, you never really know the catalyst or the timing of when it turns over. But one of the things I'm really encouraged about is just this leverage story. So the revision to the numbers that show, and who knows, it could be revised away again, is that consumers, although they've been positive, they have adopted a cautious stance. Both the 55 and older cohort and the prime age cohorts have saved a lot of the improvement in income and sentiment that they're seeing. They're not spending it in the way that they did in the 2000s. And that's rather encouraging because it gives them a cushion should things start to falter for one reason or another. So, and you know, quite frankly, we poll some external managers who, in our dynamic asset allocation process, who've actually been taking a little bit of risk off the table. They've been very risk on, becoming still net risk on, but taking off some risk. And they're seeing also that we are creeping into late, mid, or early late cycle in the economy, in which case you do start to think more cautiously, even though, as I say, if we're right in thinking the expansion goes another 3 years, it would be premature to do that right now.
So,
yeah, sorry?
No, go ahead. I have a couple more questions.
That's about it. As I say, what economists look for is some kind of stretch in the economy apart from just valuation. Is there leverage being taken? There is a group like autos and student loans where you are starting to see some extremes in terms of those two areas, which are starting to impede economics in that area, but not to the degree it could become a contagion event into the rest of the economy. And then, of course, as you mentioned, house prices in this state, in certain parts of this state, have become an extreme event. The question is whether it becomes a more generalized contagion, and then I come down slightly on the balance that I err more toward the performance of risk assets while accepting those risks.
Well, and I appreciate that. And that's the difficulty with all this. I mean, I was just, you read so much now. In U.S. News and World Report, at the end of July, posted a story relating to an obscure maritime rule related to moving to sulfurs, or reducing the amount of sulfur in ships. And it actually talks about the potential for a spike in diesel fuel that will result in a recession in 3 years. So you see this tumbling, and they're so. And why I love your report, it is so comprehensive, and it's just trying to reinforce for folks that it is a best guess situation at this time, because I don't know, Ted, if I sent you the article, I know I'd sent around, but just this interesting piece that you don't get, the maritime industry doesn't get, it's a rule waiver, it has to move to low sulfur fuels. Diesel's going to spike as a result of diesel going to $200 a barrel, goes back to core inflation. And yet these are all things as you're anticipating in the market. So, Mr. Jones, I almost wish we could have this report every month, because it is fantastic. But you guys do a fantastic job, and thank you so much.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Ms. Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Rothschild. I also love your report because it is just so comprehensive. And I had a couple of questions. I got to find the page first. Hold on. There we go. So I think you were looking at page 24 a little bit ago. And you were talking about the housing formation. Yeah. Right. So owner household formations, and that it has slightly improved from where it was. And I think I was struck by the right-hand corner, top corner of that particular graph, because so I see where owner households were real high, and you didn't show the drop-off. So I assume that was a straight drop-off to where it is in 2008.
Yeah, I just go back to zero for the start of an expansion, yeah.
Okay. So then we're looking at, and that's when rental households went up, and now we're seeing just a slight tick up, I guess, just over zero in 2018.
Net increase, yeah.
Net increase. Okay. And that's, and it's slower for the younger folks, right? That's where
No,
we're
it's
looking
actually been happening more recently for the younger folks. So that's the bottom right chart there. So the home ownership rate for people under 35 has gone up almost 2.5%
for this year?
Percentage points of their cohort in the last 2 years.
In the last 2 years,
Yeah.
okay. Because I think I remember hearing that was the hardest cohort to get into home ownership.
That was the laggard. Now it's catching up. Again, there's a long way for these things to go. You still have that cohort still reluctant to form owner households, or unable through the lending system.
Right.
They have student loans and auto loans, et cetera. So, but it's an encouraging move in the direction that they would want to see.
Okay, great. And so that's it was just one of those that particular graph really struck me as how much the recession impacted us. I really had never considered that before.
Yeah, and a lot of that is just people moving back from owning to renting. So it's the same households moving from one group to another.
Right.
Once they lost their homes.
I'm one of those participants.
Okay.
So then my other question was, and I got to find, we were on talking about the 25 to 34-year-old males,
Mm-hmm.
and non-participation in the economy. And I was a little concerned. I guess your answer to why was kind of, we don't know. Is that correct?
No, there's some evidence around the use of opioids, about prison rates, about motivation, and also about the fact that a lot of folks who are in that cohort were educated during the Great Recession, 08, 09, 10, and they've come out of college. In the early part of their workforce life, there weren't skilled jobs around that matched their education. And that's, some people are calling that a lost mini generation in terms of their participation in the labour force will never improve to where it was. So there's a number of factors that have been used to describe it, with potentially using imperfect data, so some speculation.
Okay. And I was just wondering, so I guess I thought, because I know that female employment in that age range is up. Is that because, I'm sorry, is that because of a possibility that we're paying females less and the males don't want to take that job for the, is there any data into that?
That could well be. That's a question I could take offline and try and get you an answer on. Yeah, the female participation rate has gone back a very healthy way for that age group, and whether it's a decision made within the family or, as you say, the new jobs that have been created are of a particular type that favour that. That's an interesting question. I'll get back to you on.
That would be great. I appreciate it, because I have a 30-year-old daughter and a 27-year-old son, and I believe they both fit into that. So it's an interesting thought. So, and then on your graph, your very first graph on page, not graph, I'm sorry, your trending on page 2. You had U.S. consumer sharp upward revision to measured savings flow, so which gives us more ammunition to spend going forward. And then on a negative, low savings cushion increases risk when financial markets or expectations turn adverse. So that was under low personal savings ratio. So I'm a little confused because you had both.
You've actually caught a really good thing, which is that I had to put this to the printer before that revised data came out. So you actually picked up on an element
mistake
of this. Yeah, so you can take out that thing, low personal savings ratio. That's the one that's improved.
Okay.
And again, the presentation had gone to the printer, so that's a really good catch.
Oh, okay. Well, gosh, I didn't know I was that good. So, also on page 2, hold on, and of course it just went away. I love that when that happens. There we go. And it's so tiny. There we go. Small business plans, so expanding and hiring despite difficulties in finding qualified workers. And my concern is kind of along the line of Ms. Mother's concern, is how much does our immigration policies currently impact that? Because you were talking about, when you said not much, you said legal immigration, but we have illegal immigrants that have been here for 20, 25 years and are now being deported and are so scared they're not even going to work. So is that impacting this?
I think it does. One of the things is they ask a question, what is your most difficult problem? And it used to be high regulation. So one of the things that's happened is that small businesses are now finding regulation to be a bit less of a problem. But in relative terms, yes, they are finding it more difficult to find workers, suitably qualified workers for their jobs. And that always happens as an economic cycle goes on. But in this cycle, that balance of respondent opinion that workers are difficult to find is significantly higher than it is in a typical late expansion. So you could make the inference perhaps that it's exacerbating the problem, because not only do you have a cyclical thing going on, but you also have a structural thing going on where you can't find the workers. So I would say in a qualified way that I think that's right.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate your honesty in that. I also wanted to know is there a way we can, I don't know, as we consider this, is there a way we can kind of measure that, actually measure that? I mean, in California, a lot of our businesses rely on legal and illegal immigration. So does that result, what you're agreeing with me with, does that actually end up resulting in causing some sort of economic issue, say in this state in particular, or states that rely on those workers in particular? I know that in agribusiness that's going to be an issue. So how does that impact our fund? Because I know that we have stocks in that. So, I mean...
Yeah, as I mentioned before, the last 3 or 4 economic cycles have been financial cycles, financial excesses turning to a downturn. It hasn't been a low unemployment rate that actually causes it, exacerbated by maybe some policies around immigration. But you also have another concept called stall speed economy, which toward the end of an if the economy gets to a low speed of growth because of factors like that, then it makes it more vulnerable to a financial shock. So that's probably where it would feed in there, which is that in a fast economy, you can have a pullback in the stock market or whatever and becomes less pervasive than if you've got the economy like a plane coming in, gets below stall speed, and you start to increase the vulnerability to that. So I don't think we're at that stage yet, because from at the big level, you're not seeing it in the population growth numbers from that 16 plus, but it could become a problem as you move further forward.
Right, but that population growth is actually legal immigration, so we don't actually count the illegals, do we?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how they do that. The civilian non-military population that they come up with, I'll take a look at that as well and see whether that tries to make an estimate for non-legal workers.
Okay, great. I really appreciate these reports.
Thanks for the feedback.
And like Mr. Koskin, I don't know, maybe monthly would be great. Probably too time-consuming, but I do appreciate these reports.
Cheers.
Yeah, but thank you very much, and all good questions. And I just have one, I guess, macro question. Well, one thing, I'm hearing more and more economists agree on the 3-year time period. And I think I get nervous when all economists agree on, a potential downturn. And so looking at 3 years out, the balance sheets of corporations have been very healthy, but now the trend is they're buying back equities in their companies, so they're using their balance sheet reserves. You have the federal government, interest rates are still relatively low, and so that toolbox item is no longer available if something happens. You mentioned that and the federal government is deficit spending, and they have debt that's unheard of. So I'm just trying to think, and you also mentioned that you would take the equity risk side in going forward. I thought that's what I heard you say. And so my question is where's the shock absorbers? Because you also mentioned that the individual families are saving more, but that doesn't save an economy, I don't believe. So how do we evaluate this potential downturn, getting ready to withstand, if you will, another downturn?
Yeah, and my view is that if the expansion does go another 3 years, it's probably risk asset friendly, but with that caveat that as you get to this stage of the cycle, you never know the catalysts that are going to turn it over. But I think most people have chosen 3 years because the Fed says it has another 3 years of hiking to do, or two plus years of hiking. So the Fed's own dots are saying that they're done in 2020. 2020 is when the fiscal stimulus goes away. As you say, you've then got you've got tighter monetary policy and fiscal policy starting to ease off again, tighten up again. So that seemed to be a fairly natural time, but it's much more of an art than a science in terms of probability of recession. So I agree with you that it is a bit of a worry when everyone's on that. Everyone essentially took the expansion from 2019 to 2020 recently because of the early gains that have been made from the fiscal expansion, but it's a very imprecise estimate of how long that expansion could last. And I take your point about the growth of debt. Ultimately, there's no such thing as a free lunch, so you have to look at some of the bigger leverage things like what's the US trade deficit. The trade deficit in the last blow up of the economy got to 6% of 1 year's GDP. Now it's still only 2%. That's a key indicator. The household savings pool is another one. Now that could change at some point, but you are getting this generation, or this people still have a strong memory of 2008. And they're not going on a spending spree like they did that helped to close down the last expansion. So again, overall, I'm slightly optimistic that we can keep going for a while.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the report. Okay. Okay, that concludes that item. We now go to 8B, trust level review consultants report, right?
Actually, Mr. Chair, we have a little more on the
that's
staff staff
Okay,
side,
okay.
but
They're gonna
very
go
cognizant
complete
of
their
time. I
before-
think
okay.
I think we've learned that we need to afford more time for Mr. Rothfield and the committee for sure. This is of real interest if we're going to have this two times a year. So. Eric, Elizabeth, and I will speed up this portion. And I'll just say, no offense, Rob, to you, but we won't have the small presentation on GIPS compliance, but if there are questions from the committee on GIPS compliance, we can have that at the end as well. So with that, we'll kick off the performance review for this past fiscal year. There we go. So here let me just lay out. We'll have a three-part presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the absolute return and put it in the context of what we might expect in any given year and what we've seen over the course of the past 5 to 10 years. I'm going to talk a little bit about the relative return, how we performed versus our benchmark. There'll be a little more detail from Elizabeth on the actual attribution that we've done on those returns. And then we have 5 or 6 or so slides that Eric is going to cover, really getting to this downturn question and what would the impact be to our portfolio. So that's what you'll hear from us. Starting out with the return for the fiscal year was 8.6% for the year, and that return really reflects, the equity dominance of our asset allocation. As you know, almost half of our fund is made up of global equities, and the performance for the fiscal year of global equities was 11.5%. So that is a dominant driver of our overall return. In addition to that, the other equity driver of our portfolio is private equity, which represents a little less than 8% of the total fund. And it earned in excess even of what we achieved in the public equity markets. It earned 16.1%. So this equity dominant portfolio of ours had, came through for this past fiscal year in driving the returns. In addition to that, our inflation asset class, made up of a strong component of commodities, about 25% of that asset class, earned a 9.3% return, and real estate, representing about 9% of the total fund, earned 6.8%. The last thing to mention, even though a small component of the overall fund, infrastructure, which represents 1.2% of the overall fund, it had an unusually strong performance year of 20.6% return. So really the lineup of either equity dominant or, in the case of real estate and infrastructure, asset classes with a component of equity-like return and appreciation to them all had very strong years that combined to contribute to this overall 8.6% return. Now, the flip side of that is the diversification of the overall portfolio, and in this past fiscal year, we did see that fixed income, which represents 22% of the fund, we'll see some longer time periods in a chart or two, but it returned just a little bit over 0, so 0.4%. So the combination of the equity-like asset classes and fixed income provided an overall return of 8.6%. As we've talked before, this return for the year increased our funding ratio from 68% to 71%, so that's also good news. And before I turn to the relative returns, I think you always hear some caution, and actually it's the continuation of the questions from the committee around, well, what could be coming around the corner, and of course we don't know. Both macroeconomics and the markets are a domain of randomness, and we don't have a crystal ball for the future. But what we do know is that this is the 9th year of positive returns for the portfolio. There's 8.6% return. I pulled our annual one-year fiscal year returns for the past 5 years to put this 8.6% into some context. Last year, the total fund earned 11.2%. The year before, just over 0.6%. The year before that, 2.4%. And the year before that, 18.4%. All of those returns are within what we would expect. The 8.6 that we received this year, the 0 that we received a couple of years ago, the 18 that we received 5 years ago. All of those one-year returns we would expect in any given year, at least to the 2/3 or 66% expectation of what you'd expect in any given year. So the main point of the absolute return is 8.6 is a good year from a perspective of making progress on our actuarial gains, and a good year to be rewarded for taking risk as our portfolio is positioned to do over time. Turning now to the relative return perspective. I'm going to make a couple points on this slide, one with respect to relative and the other with respect to the affiliate funds, which also had positive years from an absolute return basis. The total fund for the fiscal year underperformed our policy benchmark by 6 basis points. And we don't try to look at any one given year, either on the return side or the relative return side. But looking at over the longer time period, the 3 and 5 year period, I'm not going to address the 10-year period. We've talked about the effects of the fiscal crisis extensively here. But looking out over the 1, 3, and 5 year time period, the relative performance reflects really two things. One, a fairly moderate amount of risk-taking, using our active risk budget that the committee has outlined of about 150 basis points of active risk. So having returns that come in at or near within a 6 or 20 basis point range of the benchmark reflects both a moderate amount of at least observed risk-taking from the active risk budget, and it also reflects fairly narrow range of results in terms of the total fund. It does, though, reflect a need to review the level of active risk-taking throughout the portfolio. The investment office has been working some time to build up the total fund governance and data architecture and performance attribution architecture. And really center stage for the next 2 years will be really decomposing the level of active risk taken by the various asset classes and really measuring and really coming to some conclusions about whether or not we're being rewarded for the active risk that we're taking, and to perhaps make some shifts within the portfolio to pursue programs and efforts that we are being rewarded for active risk taking, and perhaps avoid some of the areas that we're not. But the overall message is that this is an acceptable level of risk, acceptable level of result from a relative standpoint, but disappointing, if I had to give my own assessment of it, in terms of being below the benchmark, even if marginally. Now, the only other piece to mention is there is some changes we've made to our actual benchmarks, particularly with private equity. Much of this underperformance has to do with the underperformance of the private equity portfolio as compared to its previous benchmarks, and it's been a long journey on private equity. The newly constituted benchmark will go into effect, or has gone into effect as of July 1st. And we're hopeful that that will be a better comparator set for private equity going forward. It certainly has played the role that we've hoped it would play within the portfolio, not just this year, as I mentioned, with its 16% plus return, but over the 1, 3, 5, 10, and 20-year periods, it has provided that incremental return above our stock portfolio and is an important contributor on an absolute basis to our returns. So that's something for the committee to keep an eye on going forward. I think in the interest of time, I'll probably conclude with this chart. Whoops. The one before it. There we go. Great. So here is the chart. That gray line, that straight gray line, is the actuarial rate cumulative returns, and you can see for the past 10 years, and you can see that number marches in a straight line with a bit of a kink when we adjust the actuarial return rate. And really the point of this chart is you can see the starting point 10 years ago, fiscal year 09, and that negative 20% plus return, and the hole that return placed the fund to catch up to the rate of return of the actuarial rate, and we've never caught up from that hole. And this is something that, our 10-year return, for instance, is 5.6%, and that's what those charts are telling us. And it shows that these really extreme downturns take a toll, and it takes quite some time to dig yourself out of it over time, and that will be another real focus of the investment staff and the investment committee going forward. So with that, I won't go over some of the other more particular 1 and 5 year excess returns. I will turn it over to Elizabeth to talk about the performance attribution, which will go over some of that same information. You just won't hear it twice.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ted. Elizabeth Borky, CalPERS Chief Operating Investment Officer. So we'll go to slide, in interest of time, on page 9.
There we go.
Yeah, very good. And look at the excess return attribution. As Ted mentioned, the total excess return is of -6 basis points for this fiscal year end is acceptable but disappointing, and we aim to kind of look closely into that. Let's look a bit at the number. We split this excess return into 4 components. One is the public market, one the private market, then the allocation for the public asset class, and the allocation linked to the private nature of the private asset classes. So let's dig more into these 4 components. On the public side, first, the fiscal year-end excess loss came almost entirely from the fourth quarters. The rest of the quarters were good. This fourth quarter has accounted for about -43 basis points. This underperformance on the equity side, on the global equity side, is explained by a combination of 2 things. One is explained by being overweight in defensive tilted type of value strategies. That means in the US that this resulted in being underweighted some of the mega cap tech stocks, such as the FANGs, the Facebooks, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. The second reason of the underperformance was the country positioning within the emerging market during a very volatile fourth quarter, especially in that sector. So here I want to remark still that, as Ted just mentioned before, is that our global equity portfolios are actually factor-based portfolios and are constructed such that we do not concentrate or over-concentrate the portfolio on large concentrated stocks on the benchmarks, and therefore had this kind of result. We are closely monitoring actually this exposure, particularly to some of these mega cap stocks, to stay within the risk targets. That's for the equity sides. Then on the income side, we have very positive results over the 1 year and 5 year note. These excess returns are actually resulting from 4 strategies on mortgages, on credit, on sovereigns, and on treasuries. So it's a good news there. On the inflation, the 1 year and the 3 year are positive excess return, driven by the performance of inflation-linked bonds, as well as managing the allocation between the inflation-linked bonds and the commodities. Let's turn now on the private side. Private equity, as Tan mentioned, is the highest absolute return of all programs. There is a question of benchmark that has changed, and that is reflected into these numbers. It underperformed the benchmark, the private equity benchmark, by 251 basis points this year, and 222 for the 5-year period. It needs to be noted, however, that still our private equity returns positively outperformed the global equity benchmark by 419 basis points this year, and by 179 basis points for 5 years. So we are still very happy with this. On the real asset side, the 1 year excess return of 118 basis points is driven mainly by infrastructure. On the 5-year side, the slightly negative minus 23 basis point is driven by an outperformance on the core real estate of 60 basis point, and more negatively on the real estate value added and opportunistic that underperformed both by minus 38 and minus 78 basis points over that period, as well as the real estate forest land by minus 44. So the point here that we are closely monitoring and is consistent over the trend over the past several years is to continue the real estate investment to focus on core type of investment. Now, all of these were really on the more selection side. Let's move on a bit more on the allocation side. We break the impact of the allocation into 2 buckets. One is the allocation, what we call the allocation management, and the other one, the public proxy performance. So as a definition of the allocation management here is the impact of the over and underweight applied in the public market particularly. And why do we do these distinctions is because these overweight or underweight are immediately applicable in the market. And whereas for the private market, it's more complicated and more timely to implement. So over the 1 year period, we had an overweight to equity over the first 3 quarters that contributed positively by 14 basis points, and an underweight to inflation that detracted from 11 basis points. Altogether, with some other areas contributing positively, reached out to a 9 basis point positive due to the allocation management there. On the more what is called the public proxy performance, on the sort of impact associated of being over or underweighted in public markets due to the illiquid nature of the private market. We have an underweight to private equity that was the primary detractor of minus 5 basis points that were invested in public equity. And as we just seen, the global equity benchmark actually underperformed the private equity benchmark. We had the opposite effect in real assets with the benchmark that kind of balanced the effects. So with this, I will just conclude to say again that the excess return of minus 6 basis points is what we think acceptable but disappointing, and we are addressing from a total fund perspective and from also the asset class perspective, the active risk taking we want to take in the future. With this, I pause, and I will hand over to Eric for the risk part.
We have a couple of questions on.
Sure.
Before I identify committee members who want to make a comment or question, just clarification on the private equity. Even though you have the relative basis points of 251, private equity still was our highest asset returning category.
Yes.
And what was that number?
It was plus 16% from
16, yeah.
Plus
16%.
16.1.
And then the benchmark that's been modified, is it reflected here, or it will be reflected next year?
So actually, our private equity benchmark outperformed the global equity benchmark. I have these numbers in front of me, by 670 basis points this year and by 402 basis points for 5 years.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Ms. Brown?
Thank you. My question is about fixed income, where I think we missed big, but I just want to know if that's true. It says the income was 0.4%. What was the benchmark for that?
Actually, so it's the reverse. The fixed income outperformed its benchmark. So just on the headline, the headline conclusion is fixed income on a relative basis had not only a good 1 year, but they've had a very good relative performance for the 1, 5, 10, and 20 period. The benchmark return was less than zero? Or what was it?
Exactly.
Can we go to page, attachment 2, page 5 of 24? And so I'm just trying to understand all these. This is my first time seeing all these charts and graphs. So it's very complicated as we're comparing different things to different things. So in this one, the income shows at 0.4. I don't know what the benchmark was, because it shows over 10-year the returns were 5.7. So it looks like maybe income should be much higher.
Actually, if we could go to the end of the attachment, the pages, all the way to the end. We can, yes. And this.
Could that be a little smaller?
I know.
Yes.
If you go, this is a page from attachment 4. It's page 4.
Page 4.
Okay.
It's page 4 of attachment 4. If you call that up, you might, even my own eyes now, I'm a little, I was way too optimistic on including this in case this question came up. But if you look at the income line, the fixed income line, there's our return of 0.35%, and it beat the benchmark by 38 basis points.
Yes.
So that implies a negative return of about just under zero. I thought this had the actual return, the benchmark returns on them, but they don't.
That little cheat sheet might be helpful in the future.
For you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mather?
Yes, and just to follow up on that, page 8 actually shows the excess return for the 1 year and the 5 year. So you can see there that fixed income outperformed by 38 basis points over the 1 year.
What's missing, and it's a good thing for the future, is just laying out the actual numbers for the benchmark and the actual return. You'll see that quite explicitly next month when the fixed income performance review comes. But it's a good point that. It would be a good additional chart just to make sure we have it handy.
Thank you.
So I wanted to say first that I'm very glad that we're going to be doing a review of active risk taking across the asset classes. And are you going to look at that? How granular is that going to go? Is that going to, because there's U.S. versus international performance, and there might be places where you want to take risk internationally, but maybe in the U.S. it doesn't really pay to take risk, or, I'm not saying that that is the outcome, but, how granular is that review going to go?
Yeah, I'll start, and then I'll invite either Elizabeth or Eric to add in.
Absolutely.
Fairly granularly, we've been able to build up over the course of the last 5 years, really, both the data and information set, as well as our governance architecture, which allows us to isolate more specifically the investment decisions that are made in a given year. It's actually quite complex and complicated to do that. But we think we're at a point now that with all the work that we've done from a governance side and a data side, that we can review within each asset class the whole array of decisions, the allocation decisions that are made, as well as the sub-factor decisions that are made. And that's precisely the point that we've built ourselves to now, yes. And the next phase is coming now over the course of the next 2 years to really apply that and make some decisions about some of the active decision-making that has taken place. And with that, I know Elizabeth or Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, maybe
Sure.
I can, yeah, just very quickly. I mean, we try to kind of review that exactly from our total fund perspective. So to be able to kind of go through the whole spectrum of active risks, yes, taken within the asset classes and taken at the total fund level, be able to balance them and to kind of look at the risk and the return adjusted performance of that. And in order to do that, I mean, the staff has done a sort of a huge job already in order to kind of be able to have a sort of inventory and understanding where these active risks are, and how and what are the strategies behind it. And the other great step that has been taken on was to construct a data strategy to be able to be quite agile about those, about our own understanding and overview. And the next step is then to construct and continue to construct to kind of be able to do, I would say, what I call agile decision making on that side. And be able to kind of compare the different level of active risks. This goes, of course, together with different notions of risks that are being taken at the total fund. And one notion of the risk is, of course, the sort of return and the sort of asset type of risk. I think the other part to the equation is to understand a bit how this looks like from a funding ratio perspective as well, and to see what type of active risk are contributing positively or negatively to the funding ratio as well. So it's on two sides. Thank you.
Before Eric's presentation, we're going to
I have a few more questions, I'm sorry.
On this one?
On this one,
okay,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with respect to, I just have three more things. With respect to private equity, I think it's to be expected that private equity, given its benchmark as being benchmarked against the public equities, it's expected that it would underperform in a rising public equity environment, is it not? If public equities are performing well, then we expect private equity.
Generally, yes, and then the reverse during downturns.
And then the reverse during downturns. So just wanted to make that point that we've had a strong public equity market, and yeah.
Yeah, and maybe just to add on that, because I think you raise a very, very important point, is that in all our previous private equity presentation, we have always assumed that the private equity would kind of outperform the global equity market by about 100 or 150 basis point, whereas actually when you can see from the attribution, this year we outperformed by 419 and over 5 years by 179. So I would say that we are above, what I want to say is that we had pretty defensive assumptions at that point on that private equity versus global equity relationship.
Thank you. The other thing I want to note, you mentioned that how our factor-based approach to public equities impacted the portfolio this year, and I just wanted to sort of say that this is a particular approach that we have to look at over the long term. That 1 year is we don't want to overlearn the 1 year lessons. And while these mega tech companies might have outperformed in this short period of time, or even just in the last quarter, we don't want to retrench from our factor-based approach, which we think is going to serve us well over longer periods of time.
Yeah, thank you very much for making this comment. I think it's totally true. We can be also very proud from this factor-based approach. It permits us to, I would say, navigate through the market and the specific concentration of the market that we might want to avoid as well, right?
Yes.
So the fact the fact that we use this factor-based allocation to diversify our portfolio against the sort of market concentrating is actually very useful, and especially in downturns. So this year it's a bit disappointing, but it's still very acceptable, I think, in the range of the risk that is being taken there.
Thank you. And then my last point is with respect to infrastructure. We've again seen infrastructure perform very strongly. I know it's a very small portion of our portfolio. I'm wondering how we can play a stronger role in developing the infrastructure market. I know it's a nut we've been trying to crack for quite a while. And increasing the supply side of projects that are acceptable to us given our risk parameters and our policy around infrastructure. But how can we really devote the resources we need in order to ensure that we can allocate more significantly to this asset class?
Well, on the public policy side, we were hoping for and expecting more out of the federal government from a policy perspective over the course of this last year and a half, and that certainly would be an area, Mr. Rothfield mentioned it as well, that would be helpful going forward. The actual investment team has actually done a good measured job of building up the program, and we have just shy of $5 billion worth of assets right now. So I think we're doing what we can to access, those projects that are available to the marketplace. The public policy side is one that we would need to think about how we'd want to try and enter that equation. It's something for the investment office and for the CEO as well to determine, how we spend our resources from a, policy perspective.
I do think, I appreciate there's probably a lot of things that go into that consideration, but I do think it's something we might want to consider being even more strong in that regard in terms of helping to construct a federal program or a statewide program that could actually deliver investable projects that meet our goals and also help advance the state and the country as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break to 11:32, and then we'll return with Mr. Baggeson. And I just also want to note that Mr. Bill Slayton has arrived. Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much.